Welcome back to the Fundraising Beyond Borders podcast. I am so excited to have Lindsay Ngidiwe here joining from, I believe, Chicago right now, but it's going to be really fun to hear kind of her pathway living abroad as well. But Lindsay, thank you so much for being here. Lindsay tunes in as the current U.S. Executive Director at Core Energetics, but she has a really in-depth background in international development and board service. We're going to be talking about understanding cross-cultural approaches to donations, money, giving, all of that. So, Lindsay, thank you. Thank you for being here. I'm excited to tune in and hear more from you.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm excited too. It's lovely to be here. Thank you for asking.
Of course. So let's kind of give our audience a little bit more information on your background, how you really got into the development sector, but more specifically the international nonprofit sector.
Yeah. Um, I don't know if many people start this way, but I would say I really got into this sector by accident in terms of the development side of things. In my college years, I spent a lot of time volunteering abroad. And then early in my professional career, I moved over to South Africa to work with nonprofits in the Cape Town area. Really with more looking at the social impact and a social work background. Very quickly, it turned into project management, and anyone who's had any project management grassroots experience knows that fundraising kind of falls alongside that. So if you're going to plan a new program or a new project, you're going to have to find the money to do it. So my early years were incredibly grassroots, working in youth development in Cape Town for really the first 15 years of my career, and then just kind of stepped up into learning a bit more about development before returning to the States in 2016 and taking up a role as a director of development for a foundation that worked in South Africa, but had boards in the UK and the US as well. From that director of development space is how I moved into an executive director role now in a nonprofit here in the States. But I still serve on several international boards where we have governance structures in different continents, but the actual work is done in South or Southern Africa.
Wonderful. And I'm sure so many people tuning in can really relate to the fact that even if you're a fundraiser, you most likely have done project development or project support or M&E or whatever it is. Oftentimes fundraisers aren't just fundraisers, but support a lot of different initiatives within the nonprofit world. So it would be great just to hear a little bit more too about, as you were, obviously coming from America, moving over to South Africa, I'm sure you found, some notable differences in like culturally, as well as I believe, the previous nonprofit you were working with, Timbalicha Foundation. They're really unique in a sense of they're South African based and they have South African projects, but they have a South African board, a US board, and a UK board. So they're working, really all around the world. How were you navigating, and I guess what were some of the notable differences in giving patterns across the various countries that you were working with? And it doesn't even have to be just Timbalicha Foundation, but across all your different experiences, what were some of those notable differences?
Yeah, I think this is such an important question to ask, and is really connected to one's understanding of the economics and the politics of the countries you're working with. In South Africa, part of the post-apartheid ecosystem is empowering brown and black business owners. So they've created a lot of incentives and structures to encourage businesses and corporates to give. So there's a strong culture of, I call it institutional giving or corporate giving, CSR as it's called in that context. So a lot of our work in the South African context was focused on building relationships with companies to want them to get to support our work. Move over to the U.S. context where Timbalicha USA was busy raising funds, and there is no tax incentive or built-in infrastructure for businesses to give. So in the U.S. context, you're really going to focus on an individual's passion. And actually built into the tax infrastructure in the U.S. context is motivation to give as an individual. So you're going to use very different tools, different types of conversations to be building bridges with individuals in the US. Hop over the ocean again, take yourself back to the UK, in regions of the world where there are higher tax rates, as they are throughout much of Europe, individual giving isn't as high. So you're going to see success with things like events and auctions. I remember once a German colleague visiting here in the States, and I met her in Chicago, and she said, I'm so surprised when I walk through these universities and above the gym or above the library, it says, the Smith family library. She said in Germany, the Smith family doesn't build the library, the government builds the library. And I said, that makes a
Right.
lot of sense because you're being taxed at a higher rate. So the government is going to support more of those things. So again, you need to be aware of the financial ecosystems that exist in the different countries so that you can pivot and support and really use your energy wisely. So don't
Yes.
assume that the tool that you can use in the US will be the same tool that you can use in Liechtenstein or wherever it is you're going to try to be sourcing funds from.
I think that's so key to take note of. What's going to work in the US isn't going to necessarily work in the UK. And so doing your due diligence and really doing your research. And that kind of leads me to my next question. How did you, Lindsay, find yourself in that position or really get to learn those differences and cultures? Was it, talking to other partners in different countries, or, how did you gain that knowledge, and how could a international nonprofit, if they're just in a new country, how can they dive in to learn about that giving history?
My first thing that comes to my mind is trial and error. I mean, a lot of my
Absolutely.
learning happened through mistakes and through what could have been perceived as a failed effort because it didn't yield the return I was hoping. And yet, I think if learning comes from it, there's no. I saw someone wearing a shirt the other day that says, I only win or learn, there's no failure. And I thought, that's how it needs to work in fundraising. You're going to get a lot of no's. And if you're going to receive those no's as failure, it feels like a pretty constant beatdown. But if you can pull away and learn the lesson, so a lot was trial and error. I also think when, you'll hear about this all the time in fundraising, relationship building. So I spent a lot of time connecting when I was in South Africa with other nonprofits who were getting funds from other places, learning about their relationships, asking for introductions, asking, what sort of paperwork did you have to put in place? What did they need to hear? Um, we recently did an application in the last 12 to 18 months for a South African project through a German funder, but the German funder was working with the German government. And the German government had really, really technical and specific questions that they were asking. So I want to say this ended up being a 9 to 12 month application process,
Wow.
and required weekly conversations. It required a lot of flexibility on the part of the middleman in Germany to really try to accommodate what types of information we could give and stay in integrity without making false promises, and what types of information we could give that they knew we could report on later, because that reporting back structure was incredibly, incredibly important when working with German government funds. Um, So, trial and error, building relationships with other organizations who are working with funders around the globe. And I think really going back to the first question is read about what's happening in the world. Try to understand what's happening in other economies and not deeply. I'm by no means an economist. I'm a sociologist at heart, so you're not going to catch me reading the Financial Times anywhere. But what's happening in the world, because what's happening in the world really does inform giving patterns. What are the areas of interest? What are the crises happening that are motivating giving? Um, yeah, what's happening in the political climates and the different ecosystems that would impact these types of things.
No, that's such great insight. And I want to really lean into, number two, what you said, partnerships. And I was talking a lot about that yesterday and with another nonprofit. And they were expanding into a new region, a new country. and asking for my advice. And I said, partnerships, like rely on other nonprofits that are doing similar work to you, talk to them, network with them, working with local communities, and really just listening, like doing your due diligence that way. And there's so many amazing nonprofits out there doing incredible work. And so oftentimes we don't have to reinvent the wheel. So it's how
Right.
can we learn from that, or how can we fill each other? We all have our own strengths. How can we help each other fill those gaps maybe that we have? So I think that's so crucial for especially international nonprofits to lean in on partnerships and working with each other instead of against each other.
And you and I had this just the other day. I was reading a blog from some fundraising platform that was talking about crypto giving. And I recognized the name of the organization that they were talking about. So I made contact with that organization and said, look, my colleague and I want to know more about giving. Would you tell us? So it's that sort of thing. Sign up for newsletters from other organizations and different things, just so you can become familiar with the names and the role players, and
Yep.
it's important stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to give also a little bit of more context to how Lindsay and I have come into touch. So Lindsay and I have been working together for it's been about 8 years now, which has been such a fun journey. So when I first made my move out to Livingston, Zambia, Lindsay was my basically leadership coach, and she really helped me pull out and recognize these cultural differences and understanding at the time we were working with a nonprofit that they had donors from literally all around the world. So that kind of leads into like Lindsay really helped me. We're not only working with different countries and understanding that donor behavior, but also we're working with different cultures. So it would be really great. Like, have you over the time understood and been able to identify how different cultures perceive money and giving, and kind of sharing a couple examples that way?
Yeah, it's really interesting you bring this up. Several months ago, I was on a webinar with University of Indiana is one of the first, I think the first university to offer a degree in philanthropy, because most often you're meeting fundraisers and they're not telling you, oh, I have my bachelor's in philanthropy. But the University of Indiana is offering a degree in that, and they do a lot of short courses, and they were doing one as it relates to the U.S. context and understanding Black philanthropy. And they were looking at Madam C.J. Walker, who is the first female millionaire in the States. And she's an African American woman who made her millions through hair care. And they were comparing her philanthropic efforts versus Rockefeller's and the other big names of those times. And one of the things she called out early on is I've given many of those bigger names give huge amounts because they wait until they have excessive wealth, whereas I give as I've had throughout my journey. So it may look smaller amounts, but it's because I've been committed to giving from the start. And one of the things this webinar pointed out, specific again to the US context and African American givers, is that how we currently collect data around giving in the US isolates certain culture groups and their giving patterns. So they say if we honestly collected data around giving in the US more comprehensively, that it's estimated that African American women would be the most generous givers. And they said, but because we're not collecting data from things like fraternities and sororities and in church circles
Mm-hmm.
and circles of giving like that, that all of that giving is excluded from the data sets. So it's really important to even consider how culture influences what we perceive as philanthropic success and how money moves through systems. So I found that fascinating, and it really opened up my mind in terms of how I can access different groups of people. I had
Right.
never considered going to a fraternity or a sorority before, so again, starting to pay attention to how money moves through different systems. Um, so there's countless examples of this. I think trying to think of other cultures where I'm sure as we go through some of the other questions, more examples will come to mind. I don't want to slow us down here because it's not front of mind, but I think, um, jumping to South Africa, you would know very well, this probably exists in Zambia as well, like Stockveld and savings.
Right.
So, you know, the collective use of money is also very important. It's not just about the individual.
Right.
So again, paying attention to the collective versus the individual, which would be very opposite to your strategy that you'd be using in the U.S.
Right. And
Um,
that leads to as well as like making sure that you as a nonprofit are allowing those different ways of giving to happen within your organization, as in like, how are you going to be collecting that donation?
yep,
So, you know, some people in some cultures aren't going to like or appreciate the online portion of things. Some are. Some are going to want to write a check. Some, you know, it's so powerful for some cultures to quite literally hand over cash in hand, or some, you know, in-kind donations is really powerful to them because they brought
yep,
their community together to create a blanket for a baby that's in need or whatever it might be. So it's,
yep,
I think, also kind of considering, you know, how the actual donation process
yep.
happens, and making it relevant to the cultures that you're engaging.
And on the flip side of that, it's being inclusive in your celebrations and gratitude giving as well. So often, you'll go to a website and you'll see our most recent givers are, and you've loaded logos and things like that, that are relevant to companies and things like that. But you need to make sure that through your storytelling and through your annual reports and your social media that you're telling the stories of anyone who's giving. Are they gifting in kind? You
Right.
know, and delivering things that way. Are they being represented and acknowledged and celebrated? Not just a thank you to them. I think most of us are probably pretty good at that, but collectively, are you celebrating them as you're telling your organization story?
Right, absolutely. And I guess that also, you know, it makes me think too. So we talked a little bit about donors, international donors, different cultures, having the opportunity to donate that's meaningful to them. But it's also the flip side of, okay, now that they've donated, how do you engage and keep donors, their culture in mind too? So I guess my first question is like, what have you seen when it comes to engaging international donors and how you engage them, and then keeping in mind, you know, the different cultures and I guess segmentation that in that sense.
Yeah. I may jump ahead a bit with this, but I think this story weaves well for a lot of the things we're talking about today. Several years ago, we were working with a German funder who raised funds and distributed funds. They weren't a service provider, so they made strategic relationships with service providers under the banner of children. And as they raised funds, one of the promises they made is a quarter century of impact. So, for all the money we're going to raise, we're going to promise you a quarter century of impact, which really read well on the front end from the giving website. Like, great, I'm going to give. Fast forward, 2 years, and we weren't a part of their messaging for the quarter century of impact. So, how it comes to us then is a program provider is all right, whatever you apply for, you need to be able to show some sort of guarantee that you can provide a quarter century of impact.
Yeah,
And,
25 years of impact is a
25
lot of
years. And
impact.
I initially, the team is scrambling like, all right, how can we get evidence that we're going to be able to do this for 25 years? And this is going to segue into further questions I know we're going to get to later, but like the funders in the seat of power. So you're scrambling because here's this donor that is in a perceived seat of power. And then I very quickly realized, like, this is bullshit. Like, in the third world setting, anyone who tells you they can do something for 25 years is aspirational at best, is lying at least, because it's like, the context is constantly changing. If you're working in second and third world countries, you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow, much less 25 years from now. Government strategies change, funding and infrastructure is shifted, and you have to be able to adapt. So we needed to go back to that donor and said, look, as the professionals, when it comes to program and service delivery in South Africa, we need to tell you that making a 25-year commitment to you would be unwise. It would put us out of our integrity. What we can tell you is, we will provide service as long as we're able to. And we made a couple commitments to them. Um, and it was very difficult. And when I was saying fast forward 2 years, what happened 2 years later is this German institution was in a training, and they shared with me in their training that they were learning about AQ. So, historically, everyone knows IQ. One's intelligence was the indicator of success. Then we moved into the era of EQ. One's emotional intelligence was like what was so highly valued, and what they're training now is AQ, which is adaptability quotient. So one's ability to pivot in times of change, they anticipate is going to
Wow.
be one of the greatest indicators of success. And because what they do anticipate is that the world is going to change more in the next 10 years than the previous 100 combined. So this
Wow.
German funder who was wanting a 25-year guarantee, a quarter century guarantee, was slowly learning. She said to me, "We're very worried about this AQ in Germany because we do not like lots of change." And I said, "That's all right. South Africa will teach you." I said, the roles can be reversed. Like if people know how to pivot, South Africans know how to pivot. So it was none of that happened overnight. It took years of relationship building and establishing trust through candor, through saying, "I hear you when you say this, and this is what you've offered to your donors, and I get that, and that makes sense." So really taking time to understand why they're doing what they're doing, and then taking as much time to explain why you can or cannot do that, and is there an opportunity to build a bridge in the middle? So I reference that story often because I could see very quickly the cultural implications of working with a German funder were out of alignment with the realities of working in on the ground in South Africa. And we're still working with this funder years later. And I think it's because of a commitment to understanding each other and just really candid conversations that we've been able to maintain that.
I love that. And I mean, if you think about, there's so many different cultures in that space that you're working with. Like you as an American with an American background,
Yeah.
but representing a South African nonprofit working, I know, that team at the time had a lot of, you were working with a lot of South Africans too with this same funder. So you had South Africans and then Germans too. So it's very cross cultural. But the fact that you were able just to sit down, listen, I think that's huge when it comes
Mm.
to working with multiple cultures. Listening, saying what you hear, and understanding their side of things, and then meeting in the middle. I think that's beautiful. We all have to work harder at doing that. But the fact that you were brave enough to not change your ways just because of a funder and some good money, but what's actually sustainable for that community that you're working
Mm.
with.
Mm.
Always keeping in mind that community, not just shifting because of funding.
Absolutely. And I mean, I want to be clear. It was hours of listening. Like it's not
Sure.
nothing. I mean, it really is the meat of your time. Hearing what they're interested in and being creative about where you can find alignment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that was it's all kind of been what we've been talking about. Is a big question I wanted to ask you today was, what are some best practices for nonprofits to mitigate power imbalances, to make sure really that we're equitable and we have really great engagement with donors from various cultural backgrounds. And that can be with funders, that can be with individual donors. So going back to my question of like donor engagement, not necessarily even just funders, but like one-on-one donors when it comes to email marketing or things like that. I guess, do we start within our staff, within our board? Does it then filter down to our donors? So yeah, have you seen any best practices to help mitigate that power imbalance?
Internally, one of the things that I did with my team quite often, when you mention power imbalances, the first thing that comes up for me is like staying in your integrity, and being candid about it. So, Don't make promises you can't keep. Don't say you can do things that you can't do because you hope you can if there aren't plans and strategies in place. Um, on the flip side, I also needed to spend a lot of time creating flexibility with the team around how we were able to message what we do and stay in our integrity. So,
Yes.
for instance, we wanted to set up an individual giving campaign, a recurring donations thing to just support regular money coming in. And in the traditional context, especially in the African context, this would often come up through like a sponsor a child campaign. What we realized very quickly is we did not have the administrative back end support to be able to monitor like one child's progress and report it back to a donor. So we had to really look at, okay, how can we meet the need for individual connection and inspiration in a way where we were actually could honestly report back on the progress of what was happening.
Right.
So we moved to a sponsor a desk campaign. And what that did is that created flexibility on the back end for us to funnel money through individual recurring gifts towards our education projects without it being tied to the performance of one specific learner.
Yes.
So we used narrative, we used storytelling. We tried to really still spend a lot of time creating personal connection. And to be in our integrity, we knew we couldn't connect that learner to donor.
Right.
So again, spending a lot of time with the team about, all right, how can we say the same message in a different way to a different group of people? So don't assume that the same message is going to land in the same place with the same
Yes.
impact. And a lot of times, my meetings start with like, are you willing to look at this a different way? So one, acknowledging the way that you are looking at it, and two, are you willing to look at it from a different perspective? Because if you aren't, then we have a bit of work to do to get us willing to look at it a different way.
Right.
And
Right.
then, moving into what are some other perspectives we could take
Ab-
in. Or
Absolutely. I actually want to pause right there because I know a lot of international nonprofits have this one-to-one type of donation opportunity. So like a sponsor a child or sponsor a animal or whatever it might be. So it's one-to-one. So they want to sponsor one specific child, one specific um, dog, whatever it might be. And exactly what Lindsay is saying, it's really challenging for a nonprofit, especially if you're a small to medium sized nonprofit, to keep up with that donor, right? So Lindsay and I have worked with several nonprofits, and currently working with three right now, actually transitioning them out of that one-to-one to a more like sponsor desk type of platform where it's sponsored education. It's not the one-to-one. You are still impacting, that child's education. But still holding integrity into your ethical storytelling. So,
yeah,
as well as, how you're properly communicating that child and that community as well. Still having it's a really fine balance. Still having to storytell, especially to an American donor who might not fully understand, the challenges and barriers it is to access education, in Africa. Or in Zambia, if we're going to look at a specific country, an American donor is not necessarily going to fully understand it. So, how do you still make them understand, but ethically and held up with integrity? And yeah, thinking about all of that. So, I would highly, if you do have a one-to-one program and you have found yourself really kind of heavy with the administrative back end, thinking of and going Timbalicha, their website is hope.org.za, and they have a sponsor desk program, and that's kind of what Lindsay's referring to right now. And it's not that one-to-one, but you're still impacting a child's education or a person's education. They do both youth and adult employment
yeah,
opportunities. So looking at that model and helping you kind of focus and focus on holding that integrity of that community that you're supporting and
yeah,
impacting.
yeah. As you were
Um,
talking, I began thinking about power imbalances that exist beyond the one-to-one reach, informing the individual donor about what's realistic to expect, but also how do you do this when you're working with organizations and grant funders. And I do
Yes.
want to name that I have found 90% of the time, and probably even more, that institutional funders are willing to engage around shifting the target. So we didn't reach this and dot, dot, dot. You explain why, take radical responsibility for why the target wasn't met. No blame, no whatever. Name the context, take responsibility for it. And then name whether or not that's a target that you should still be working towards or whether or not the target needs to shift. And take responsibility for having that conversation. Don't wait until the funder comes to you. The minute that you see that there's going to be a problem hitting that target, bring it back to the donor and talk with them about it.
Right.
And I think a lot of times the perceived power imbalances are just that, perceived. So I think it's really, as service providers and as directors of development and program managers, really taking responsibility for leaning into your authority and your expertise, and taking the reins. Don't wait until it's reporting time. Tell them from the start when you can forecast that there's going to be some form of variation happening.
I think that's so important. I think that's very important. And, we talked a lot about donors and funders and thinking about different cultures and where they're located. And now it's kind of like shifting, Lindsay, because you've been able to also not only work with different donors and individuals from around the world, but also staff and board members. So how important is it? And I guess what have you done to ensure your past staff members or board members remains culturally aware and respectful in their different interactions? So, working with Timbalicha Foundation, you were working with a South African board, a UK board, and a US board. So did you have to change how you were communicating and thinking about different cultures? But then also, how were you keeping them aware of I guess, in that distance, that South African culture, and making sure
Yeah,
that they,
yeah.
yeah, were aware?
It's interesting because I studied sociology and anthropology, and I want to name that. Like, I get excited when I look at this cultural piece. So, some of the things that excite me might not excite the average fundraiser. So, I just want to name that and say that's part of my human ecosystem and just part of what I enjoy about life. And I name that to say, I remember reading some research, and I'm not going to name, I think it was Hofstede. I'm sorry if it's wrong, and I don't want to
That's okay. We
misquote
can update
anyone.
it in the show notes
Okay.
as well. That's no
Okay.
problem. Yeah.
Who looked at power distances in different cultures and how that impacted organizations and how effectively they worked. And he was from Holland. He said, an example in the US and in Holland, there's a very short power distance between the top and the bottom. So there's high expectation of collaboration. People at all levels are going to want to offer input. Um, yeah, there's just a smaller gap from the top to the bottom. And he looked at other nations, and I think at that time he named Honduras as having the highest power differential from those seated at the top, metaphorically, and those in the lower sections. And they said, in those systems where there's a great power difference, and I don't even like using top and bottom language, so I want to
Sure.
name that now, but I think for this reference, is that those on the bottom have no expectation of collaboration. They actually just want to be told what to do. Because in their ecosystem, that's where they find safety, is being able to say, well, so and so told me to do this, so that's what I did. My experience is that South Africa sits with higher power differentials than the US and the UK. So often when I'm working across boards where I'm wanting collaboration, I sometimes experience resistance to it. And it's a really tricky question to ask because ideally, if you're in the US and the UK and you're just a funder, South Africa should be telling you what to do because it's their programs. They are the experts on what's happening in their area. And yet I realized it was important for me to understand some of the resistance that existed in that space. And I think it was connected to the power structures and the sociology of power in those different places.
Wow.
So I don't have any quick fixes or answers other than to say bring mindfulness around power distance into these conversations, and how that may influence how what you're saying is being heard.
Right.
So don't assume that what you're saying is landing the way you intended to. Watch for the impact of what you're saying, because often that will tell you whether or not your intention was achieved. So that's been really important to just pay attention to as I'm in these, especially as it's related to boards and governance. How is power at work in all of these situations?
I think that's really good. And do you have any ideas, and maybe not, or did you working with past clients and nonprofits that had international boards, do you have any ways or ideas to engage boards in multiple different countries coming together though? Have you ever
Yeah.
done that? So where, the US, UK, South Africa, or wherever a nonprofit might be based, is it important to bring everybody together instead of having multiple different conversations? Share a
How we
little bit more about that.
managed it for purposes of productivity, instead of bringing everyone together, is we had representatives from the different groups. So
Great.
there was always, in the current organization I work with, there's always a South African representative on the US board and in the UK board. And this means they're able to update us on what is the South African board saying, what's the progress happening on the projects. And then they are able to also then bring information back. Okay, the US board says they have this many resources to support you with that project that we just told them about. So
Yeah.
for purposes of governance and board, this is my personal opinion, I would avoid complete collaboration because it will get very messy and I think is unnecessary. So you don't need your full UK board, your full US board, your full,
Sure.
maybe for a social hour just so you connect and get to know each other. But again, governance is supposed to be high level, strategic, not getting into the weeds. So I think having a representative from where your programs are happening in that governing body play a role on the other boards is effective and not too heavy a lift administratively.
Great. Yeah. I think those are really good points to consider. And right now, a fundraising beyond borders client, we have a client, they are US and Tanzania based. So the US arm really is fundraising, right? So they're mostly fundraising. That's what they're there for. And they're really proud that, everything in Tanzania that is being run on ground is locally led, community led. So the projects are coming directly from the communities, but the U.S. is really just there to kind of support them with the fundraising side of things. And Lindsay is actually walking them through a couple different processes right now of how to engage the board and setting up different processes. So when it comes to, and maybe Lindsay, you can kind of share some like insights of working alongside them over the last month or so. Like when it comes to engaging an American board and making sure that they're engaged. I think, a gap that we found right now is that they don't feel as engaged, not understanding or knowing what's happening with the projects in Tanzania. So we're trying to figure out like some systems to put into place. What are some good systems that, for in this example, Tanzania, how can they report back to the board, or what processes can we make sure that, if you're having projects abroad, that the other boards are aware of what's going on, and what's relevant, what's happening in the organization?
Yeah, yeah. There's a couple of really high level things that are pretty easy things to put in place. And I say that under the banner that, sometimes when you're overwhelmed, nothing seems easy. So for those of you that are in the middle of nothing's easy, I hear that. I've had those seasons too. Um, I think having a mission and a vision and a value statement, guidelines for the board. I'm on a board now that reads them at the start of every one of our meetings.
Oh, I love that.
So, for instance, if you have an organization that is raising funds for Tanzania, reading your vision, we want to support school children in Tanzania. The mission, our mission is to fundraise and provide resources to them, and then having your values and your guidelines. really informs how you're going to spend your next 60 to 90 minutes. And, will help you avoid the rabbit trails. Sometimes you get too in the weeds. So I think building that practice into your governance structure of having those things clearly labeled and naming them. And then a few other steps you can take is, um, making sure on your board agenda that there's time for reporting back. So on a different board I'm sitting on, our full agenda is, feedback from fundraising committee, feedback from the finance committee, feedback from programs. So you don't have to worry about, well, when are we going to talk about that? Your agenda is clear. We're going to get to programs halfway through the meeting. There's going to be a program update. And that's included in written form. So your program update would come in a week before your board meeting, gives all your board
Mhm.
members a chance to read it. Then they can come to the meeting with their questions. So again, it's building like the really basic building blocks into your meeting agendas. And I think to tie it up, the reason why the values and the vision and the mission are so important is because sometimes, because we do this as foreign board members, we're going to want to get involved in stuff that's actually none of our business. So those tools that we're going to use at the front of the meeting, our mission is to raise funds, not to mandate which teacher is teaching that class.
Right,
So it's a
right.
good reminder to say this is important. And, hopefully your chair would say, we're off track. Let's remember we read these things in the beginning, and pulls them back on track. And then one final piece that I've seen support us in our work at Tembalicha would be, sending through quarterly reports from the ground. So on the off months that you're not meeting as a board, if someone could be sending, here's what's happened, whether it's quarterly or last month, project highlights, program updates. And again, you don't have to recreate the wheel every time, but some reporting mechanism that facilitates that feeling of connection. And whether it comes through a newsletter or reporting, I find that between that and quarterly meetings, you can satiate the desire for wanting to know more.
Right, absolutely. And I think too, this all reminds me of as well. I'm thinking about this specific nonprofit and their budget. And why I'm bringing that up is because is recognizing certain line items that maybe a national nonprofit might not have, that they need in order to be effective as a board or as staff or whatever it might be, to take in those cultural like sensitivities. So that might be like professional development and training within your organization. So making sure that your staff is fully equipped, to understand those cultural differences, and to recognize those cultural differences and act upon them. And then too, like there might be some line items there for travel. Connection is huge. So making sure that your staff members are able to, be represented in whatever countries that you're abroad, or bringing the different cultures together, with an annual staff meeting, whatever that might be. So it's also kind of thinking too. I don't know if you can think of anything else, Lindsay, but like thinking about your budget, and it's going to look a little different than a national organization, and putting those things in so it can just really enhance your overall sustainability of your nonprofit.
Absolutely. And just going back to what you were naming in terms of training, we discussed this just yesterday with our work with this Tanzanian organization that we're talking about. As I said, we were talking about trust. And when I was in South Africa, I had a dear friend studying organizational psychology. And they, in this textbook she had, it said, universalists establish trust by a fixed contract. You commit to doing A and you do A, and you put your name to it, and that's what's going to happen. And I would assume that is, in the Western context, the baseline definition for trust for most people. However, it wasn't my lived experience when I was in South Africa. And then I read this textbook, and it said pluralists establish trust on the shared understanding that things change. And I remember
Yep.
like it hitting me in the face, because my perception was that the first thing I told you is trust. And it's our responsibility to teach everyone, to empower everyone to know that this is what trust looks like. Whereas I realize, oh, is it also as much on me to accommodate the second definition of trust
Yep.
that, oh, I understand things change. Can I offer flexibility? Can, and it's hard because those are really opposing definitions for the same concept. So even and I brought this to this board. So as you're considering who you want your role players to be, oftentimes we'll be like, I trust so and so because they said they're going to do A and they're going to do A. Well, really, that's using our metric, our standard. But through these trainings, are we willing to use other metrics or another place's standard to support us and are really like mutually beneficial, which is what you want
Right.
a
Right.
relationship.
Right.
So I can't emphasize that enough, like the importance of learning those types of things and prioritizing it in your budget.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. Lindsay, this has been truly incredible because, a lot of our episodes are around, the fundraising tips of tricks of how to, of individual giving and peer to peer. And I think it's so important and not talked about enough, especially within international nonprofits, to take into these accounts when it comes to cultural differences and recognizing them, the approaches to it, thinking about your donors, your board, your staff members, all that, all of it. I think it's so important. So thank you so much for being here and breaking it down. Lindsay does support nonprofits with coaching as well, leadership coaching, and a lot of this is kept in mind. Like Lindsay's saying, we're working with a client right now and supporting them a lot with their board and even some project managers in Tanzania. So feel free to reach out if you find yourself in that place of how do I train and empower my staff, my board members. We're definitely here for you, and Lindsay is as well. And Lindsay, is there anything that you wanted to share that we didn't cover today?
No, really just to name that, like, this is learned through going back to what I said in the beginning, trying and failing.
Yeah.
I don't even know my age at this point. And so it's now been 20 years of trying. So, like, be really gracious with yourselves as you're learning these things. It's not about getting it right the first time, but it's being resilient. Something didn't work. All right. What are we going to try differently next time?
And I think the first step is listening. Don't you think, Lindsay?
Yeah,
It's just like taking that opportunity to listen, to understand, and then, that next step is the implementation of how are you going to change that within your organization. But
yeah,
I would say, that first clear step is just listen and talk
absolutely.
to other communities, other cultures, especially the ones that are relevant to your organization.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, Lindsay, thank you so much for being here, and till next time.
Thanks.